All right, so by this point we have a pretty good handle on the basic functions of sculpting. Now, sculpting is often used for organic forms such as the tree that we did in our last demo, but most frequently it is used for living things such as characters or creatures. And all of these types of things are symmetrical in nature. So we need to learn how to sculpt using symmetry in Blender. Now, to demonstrate this, I have a quad sphere here. That is a sphere that is created of all quadrilateral faces. And to create this quickly in Blender, we can just start from a new sculpting template. So if you're creating a new file in Blender, File, New, instead of choosing General, we can come down here to Sculpting. And the new file it has created for you will be in sculpting mode. You'll have the sculpting workspace open and you will have this quad sphere here for you. Now, if you need to get your layout mode back, you can always add any of the tabs that we had loaded previously into this sculpting template. Okay, so let's talk about sculpting with symmetry in Blender. Now, in the past, if we have needed something to be symmetrical, we have gone and used a mirror modifier. So let's go ahead and do that now. And I'm also going to turn on my axes here just so we have a better idea of where we are in space. So we have a mirror modifier. Let's just start sculpting. And you see that our strokes are indeed being mirrored across the x-axis here. So this is great, you may be thinking, but we're going to quickly see that mirror modifier is actually not the way we want to go because it's not really supported in sculpt mode. And you may think, okay, well, I need to change this. Let me enable dynamic topology by coming up here. And now we have this warning here that says generative modifiers detected. Keeping the modifiers will increase your poly count when returning to object mode. Well, we've gotten warnings up here in the past and we've ignored them. So let's just click OK. But now we're getting this warning here in our mirror modifier panel that says it's not supported in Dynotypo. And indeed, if we even move or click and sculpt anywhere, our strokes are not being mirrored. Well, okay, we know of another way to get more geometry in Blender and in sculpting mode, and that is with the multi-res modifier. So let's just use that. Let's add a multi-res to our modifier stack and notice that the multi-res is snapped up to the top, and this is just the nature of this modifier. It just needs to be at the top and Blender will only allow it to be at the top. So let's go ahead and subdivide this a couple times. And now you'll see we also are still getting an error down here that says not supported in sculpt mode. And if we sculpt, our strokes are not being mirrored. So this is why we cannot use the mirror modifier with sculpting in Blender. Instead, we just need to use the sculpting X symmetry options. And these can be found up in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You'll see this icon here that has a little butterfly on it, and that denotes symmetry. So to mirror our strokes across any axis, simply enable the axis button here. We have X for the X-axis. We have Y for the Y-axis. And of course, Z for the Z-axis. You can enable multiple axes at the same time to mirror in more directions. These settings can also be accessed by coming into the Properties Editor panel, clicking on the Active Tool panel, and coming down to the Symmetry option. Let's click to enable this dropdown. Here we have the mirror axis options that we were exploring right up here in this sort of shortcut panel. But we also have a few more. So lock, and then we have these axis buttons. So enabling these will lock the transformation of your vertices on that axis. So I have locked the x-axis here. So when I draw in the y direction, everything is normal. And as I come around to the x, my points begin to move less and less. It's because they are locked in the x. And of course you can lock in the y. If I draw around this way, suddenly when I reach the exact y direction, my points are not being moved anymore. And the z, we'll lock it in the z. You can see it is drawing out here and not drawing there. And of course, just like any of these other options, you can use multiple axes at the same time. So I can draw on the z, but once it starts getting down to the equator of this sphere, my mesh is no longer being sculpted. Right. Next is the tiling settings. So tiling is going to repeat your stroke across your mesh in the direction that you select here. So when I have X selected, you can see that when I hover over my mesh, I'm getting these two additional blue dots on the either side. And that is just telling me where the tiling is going to be drawn. So let's move my cursor right here. So we have two of those cursor dots on the mesh, and let's just draw a stroke. So it looks similar to mirroring because I am doing it across an axis, but I can change the spacing of this by coming down to the tile offset spacing options and changing this slider. So if I change this to something like 0.5, you can see these dots are now much closer together. And if I changed it down even lower, let's put it at 0.25, now we see we get this multiple, we're getting multiple strokes drawn across our mesh in the X direction. Like any of these other settings, this works with any of these axes, and you can do multiple at a time to create these sort of grids. Let's look at these radial settings right here. These settings will allow for radial symmetry in the desired axis. The number here determines how many times the stroke will be repeated within 360 degrees, a complete circle around the central axis. So by default, everything is 1. So when I draw everything, it is just like a normal brush stroke. You have one stroke being drawn under your cursor. Let's increase X to 2. And now when we look at the previews, we can see how it will create radial symmetry around this X axis. We can change it to increase the number. Let's increase it to 6. And now you can see I have even more symmetry around this X point. We can increase this number in any of these directions or multiple just by entering the number here. Drawing will give you a preview of what that would look like. So we have it here and here. All right, the last thing I want to look at with the symmetry options is the symmetrize button. Now, let's say you come in and you start sculpting on your mesh and you forget to turn symmetry on. And you realize all of a sudden that, hey, wait, I need this to be even across the axis. Well, we can do this after the fact without having to redo our sculpt by using the Symmetrize button. So just down here at the very bottom of the Symmetry panel under the Active Tool tab in the Properties editor, we have this button that says Symmetrize. Let's just click it and see what happens. So you'll see here that what it has done, has copied whatever was on this half of the mesh and mirrored it over to this half, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted in this case. We wanted the negative x half of the mesh to be copied over to the positive half. And how do you know if this is positive or negative? Well, if you hit 1 on your numpad to go into front orthographic view and look at the x direction lying this way, think of it as a number line, right? With the world origin being 0, all the positive numbers would go to the right and all the negative numbers will go to the left. So because I drew on the back of this, I was drawing on the negative x half of the mesh. But say you didn't draw on that. Say you drew on the positive half, well, no problem. You can still use the Symmetrize. You just have to come down to this drop down here and change it to positive x to negative x. So it's going to take this positive half and it's going to mirror it onto this. If we click Symmetrize, same result. And as you can imagine, any of these axes can be mirrored positive to negative, negative to positive in any direction simply by choosing its option here in the drop down. All right. So that is all there is to sculpting, really. Actually, I take it back. That's not all there is to sculpting, really. There's one more thing I missed, and that is just something to notice about the Symmetrize button is that it does not work with a multi-res modifier. So if I have a multi-res on this mesh and I have sculpted some detail into that subdivision level, but let's say I need this symmetrical now, coming into the Active Tool panel and coming down to the Symmetry tab, you'll see that Symmetrize is grayed out. And this is just by nature of the multi-res modifier, the way it works. You cannot have anything that's going to remesh your object programmatically. So it's just something to note. It's not going to work with this. You would have to either apply or get rid of this modifier and then symmetrize it. It will, however, work with dynamic topology. You can sculpt on this side, come into the Active Tool panel and hit Symmetrize. Okay, so that is all I wanted to cover about sculpting. We're going to move forward with a demonstration on sculpting with symmetry in the next video.